Consider supporting Archaeo-Scope on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to another Archaeo-Scope. This series is kind of like an inverted questions of doom, where rather than you sending me a question to try and answer to the best of my ability, I put a question out there for you in the form of a video for you to watch, consider, comment below, discuss and debate with other people, and hopefully together we all come out of this process with a greater understanding of the topic at hand than one of us on our own might have achieved. And more often than not, this absolutely includes myself. More often than not, I use this series to share ideas and concepts that I'm working through myself, and I very much appreciate your input. Now today, the topic is directly inspired by a post on Facebook. I shared on the Archaeo-Scope Facebook page a video which was all about an Italian company who are producing biodegradable pods, organic burial pods, where people are placed in the fetal position in the ground, and their substance, their remains, directly feed a living tree. And the idea here is to sort of explicitly replace gravestones with forests. And there's actually also a miniature version, like a coffee cup almost, like an urn, where ashes are mixed with nutrients and other necessary things in a biodegradable cup that you bury in the ground, and out of that grows a tree. So it doesn't have to be a body, it can be the remains that are recovered following a cremation. And I shared this on the Facebook page, really wondering, what does this mean for future archaeologists? And it's a legitimate question, in so much as this isn't just a fringe idea anymore. Last time we were in Wales, we drove past a graveyard where roughly half of the space had been set aside for woodland burial. They were encouraging trees to grow, and people would be buried amongst the trees. It's not quite the same idea as literally being a pod that will feed an individual tree, but it's a similar notion, passing your remains back into the nitrogen cycle, that kind of thing. And then actually not too far from here, where we live in the northeast of England, on the A1, sort of up towards Berwick and that direction, there's a sign by the road proudly proclaiming that woodland burials are possible in that plot. Not too far from the A1. So this is becoming an increasingly common practice, and therefore it's going to be a future burial type that will be studied probably by archaeologists. And I'm intrigued by the response to this. People in the comments were fascinating. I just want to share some of those comments with you guys. For example, Amanda Brainard said, I manage a cemetery and do a lot of work for the mortuary anthropology field as a result. My consulting firm is the Northeastern Coalition for Cemetery Studies. That's a fairly hardcore name. I like it. You know, that's a serious name. 1. Burial pods will disrupt how we label graves. Already we are fighting the damage to gravestones and what is done by biological growth. And that's actually a common problem in the UK as well. I've talked about this in previous videos. I think actually in a recent video about our relationship with death, is the way that graveyards and gravestones, after a certain amount of time, it seems, and in some places, and often also depending on budget, can fall into disrepair. You know, nature can reclaim them anyway, and often records therefore can be at risk. Also erosion as well, wind and rain and this kind of thing. 2. Having a tree as a grave marker makes future burials and records very difficult to maintain and manage. We're already running into problems where we do not have the resources to be able to properly identify burials when we get a call that a burial needs to be done in 3 days. I've handled these situations for 5 years. Wow. While the idea of a green burial is great for places where traditional kist burials, sorry, I always say that wrong, kist burials, the term I use for a coffin inside a vault burial, she says, don't make sense, I'm not sure modern cemeteries will be equipped to manage this type of burial. Well, that's not necessarily the case. As I've just been identifying, there are already graveyards, for example, here in the UK that offer that, and these are just ones that we just happen to have spotted. I'm sure there are more than two, you know. And then there is the personal. My grandparents have just a tree marking where we spread their ashes. We run into oral history problems when graves are not marked. For example, the living memories now of World War One on the home front are those of young adults and children. Well, actually, I suppose just about. World War One is almost passing out of memory, isn't it? They are not always accurate. The written records in a cemetery maintains that a cemetery maintains may be more accurate than someone telling you where Uncle John was buried. And expecting cemetery maintenance people to be able to recognise a tree is presumably less practical than recognising a graveyard or a gravestone using records. I think that's what they're getting at. Living memory becomes cultural consciousness. Events like 9/11, that everyone remembers it happening, they're aware of the event. This is cultural consciousness. But what happens when the generations that are aware of the cultural consciousness, or the living person, I suppose, in this instance, are no longer passing it on? That's a good question, definitely. Paul says, make mine apple, that way I can be converted into cider. Kat says it looks beautiful, but what will be left for archaeologists of the future? Help, we need some inhumations. Now, that's true. This is why I was interested by this, is that will this sort of practice literally actively consume all elements of the human that is buried? If they're ashes, absolutely. Presumably as well, you know, calcium in bone, every element of your body, probably with the exception of maybe enamel, maybe in your teeth, will just be consumed eventually by a tree. So that's true, and in that sense, perhaps yes, we need some sample inhumations from every generation in order to, you know, to have some bones possibly for the future. But then again, that's not a guarantee. I was talking to someone just a couple of days ago about how in the northeast of England there's no real evidence in Northumbria. I always get the two muddled up. It's now called Northumberland. It was called Northumbria, but Northumberland sounds more like a country, doesn't it? Or a kingdom. Anyway, Northumbria, in the Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, there's very little grave evidence because this soil is simply not suitable for preserving especially skeletons. If you're lucky, you get a stain and you get some grave material and you get the grave cut, so you can see where the soil changes colour where there was once a grave, but the bones disappear. I think something similar also was happening in Binchester as well last time I was there, where again, just because of the chemistry of the soil, it's either too acidic or it's too alkali, or something about the hydrology will just mean that human remains just don't remain, if you see what I mean. So actually that's already an issue with, even, you know, despite the idea of woodland burials, interestingly. Sebastian says that Kui from Canada, or Kui from Canada, this makes me think of Omam Iwini / Owada, Odawa / Anish Shinabi, story of the first white birch tree, about how a young man became the first birch tree. That's interesting. So sort of reminiscent of in this instance, I think, native populations in Canada and their stories of plants coming out of where people maybe were killed or where they were buried. Actually, there are some similar stories that come out of, for example, Celtic Christianity. There are, you know, trees that grow where a certain saint was martyred, or founts of water. In the case of Holywell, actually, just up the road from where I'm from, that was a place where apparently a saint, you know, dropped dead or had their head chopped off or something, and water came out of the ground. But also, I do believe there was a myth about the vanilla as well. Vanilla being a plant that came into being when a princess was killed, having eloped with her love. She was eventually tracked down and killed in Mexico, possibly, and that led to the vanilla pod becoming apparently. So yeah, these myths tying people and events to plants. That's interesting, and yeah, this absolutely would become part of the common conversation surrounding graveyards in that sense. I like that. A cherry tree for me, says Barbara, with lovely spring blossom. Absolutely. Becky is concerned that the roots won't necessarily go down very far, so would it have to be a shallow burial in order for roots to actually access the pod? Presumably, well, in the case of a generalised woodland burial where you're basically buried in like a wicker coffin, the idea is that you sort of pass into the background of the soil, so your chemistry adds to the soil's vitality and therefore eventually comes into trees. But I think in the case of this one, with the actual organic burial pods, the pod is shaped and the roots are tapped in a way that actually encourages the roots to go down and around the pod and into the pod, obviously, in order to get at the lovely juicy bits. Because I mean, cards on the table, the notion freaks me out. It does, but then again, my further thought immediately is actually, you know, if you're in a standard coffin, unless it's hermetically sealed, stuff's going to get in, and you're going to become part of the environment again. You know, dust to dust and all that. So this is a more directed, more productive, more obviously productive, I suppose, version of that cycle occurring. And George suggests that there will be a lot of tree holes, sort of like post holes, I suppose, but evidence where trees were growing. And yeah, that's also true. It may well be that the future archaeologists studying burial practices in Britain, for example, may well start to identify funerary forests, and maybe the remains of where a funerary forest was cleared, for example, perhaps ahead of a hover car production plant. Meet George Jetson. But yeah, this idea of the remains of trees then becomes an issue, doesn't it, as well? How do you identify how do you identify where a tree has been if it's no longer there? How do you identify the difference between a tree that is simply a natural tree and a tree that's attached to a human burial if the remains are gone and there's no artifacts in the ground? And beyond that, how do you identify the difference between a natural forest and a funerary forest? These are interesting, and this all comes back again to this question of managing the day-to-day running of such a cemetery, and the slight headache there. That said, though, it was suggested, I do believe, in the comments that it is possible for people to have plaques attached to trees, or maybe a small stone next to the tree. That's true. And of course, eventually the tree will grow and will push that stone out of the way. It will require maintenance, but then again, a graveyard requires maintenance. Sandy says, I find cemeteries fascinating places, been to more than my fair share of them. Me too. I haven't thought about planting seed pod burials in rows. That would create many problems, she says. And what if the tree dies? What if a storm occurs and destroys many of the trees? Are they replaced? Would someone in 50 or 75 years replace their ancestors' tree? It's hard enough to get people to replace destroyed headstones. Yeah, that's true. Many things to think about, much less the archaeology for future. Much less the archaeology for future archaeologists. Well, that's true. Again, in terms of day-to-day maintenance, there's loads to think about. But maybe actually engaging with the conversation is sort of what we need. As I said in that previous video about our relationship with death, maybe we need something to you know, to start a conversation, to actually get us to think about this stuff and to actually engage with conscious funerary practice, especially, for example, in modern Britain. Yeah. Uh, Sam says, I think we need to consider this idea in more than just an archaeological context. Sure, it might make it harder to identify remains, but how is this much different than most archaeology? Native American archaeology all over the US lacks burial information. That's the whole point of archaeology, figuring out what isn't written down. That's true. Additionally, why couldn't a tombstone or plaque be added to the foot of a tree? Exactly. This is the comment I was getting at. Who was buried? Stating who was buried here. It's no different than cemeteries today. Also, you can't. Also, I think you can't just consider this an issue because it's bad for archaeology. This would be much better for the environment. And frankly, when I die, I'm sure as hell not going to be put in a box. I love the idea of returning to the earth when I'm gone. This formal idea of cemeteries that we know today is such a westernized way of thinking. I love that people are getting creative with new ways to dispose of the dead. And that, I think, is something that I love. I love the fact that people are thinking about, well, as I say, they're actually thinking about this stuff. They're actually engaging with cemeteries. Aren't just someplace where you just plonk the dead. And actually, this notion of it not being an issue, because that's what archaeologists do anyway, try and figure out what's not written down. Well, that's kind of true. That said, though, archaeologists would love, and do in fact love, to take advantage of written evidence where it's possible. You know, having someone's name attached to the grave would be very useful, because otherwise the name is lost. But then again, is that a bad thing? There are cultures, for example, in ancient Egypt, where the name of someone was crucial to their identity and to their continued existence in the afterlife, but also, in a practical sense, their existence in people's minds, the people who continue to live, their family, their friends, their priests, so on and so forth. So the name was crucial, and is crucial for many different cultures. But, you know, in a prehistoric setting, for example, in Britain, it seems fairly clear that the relationship between the dead and the living was very close. People intermingled with burial practices and living practices, feasting, for example. Human remains were passing through the community all the time. But it's also clear, therefore, that it's likely that these remains came to represent the ancestors. So you may well talk about a named ancestor, and in that sense, it doesn't really matter which bit is in your house or which bit you have just met with in a barrow, for example. You will be sort of mapping onto all of those remains, whatever story it is that you're telling within your family, and maybe that's something that we need to develop, is more of a narrative. That said, though, I'm sure most people can't be bothered to do that, unfortunately, at the moment. And so I can see why there's an issue here. You know, the record keeper in me goes, please just keep good records. But the anthropologist in me, the archaeologist, thinks, well, actually, human beings have excellent memories, and we have a wonderful capacity to remember tremendous amounts of familial information. We just don't do it. So maybe we need to start doing it, and perhaps this sort of burial practice would help with that. Hence the video, hence the Archaeo-Scope. I would love to see this conversation continue in the comments below, because obviously eventually that post on Facebook is just going to drop out of relevance and disappear into the timeline. So I thought I would reinvigorate the conversation, put it on this video, and hopefully we can continue in the comments, because it's an interesting one, and it's not as straightforward as at first it may seem. As I say, human remains aren't permanent fixtures anyway, and in certain parts of the world they're very rare already. Maybe actually we're not necessarily talking about just the archaeological legacy of these funerary forests, but also actually the cultural currency, the relevance now of how we dispose of the dead, and what that means for all sorts of psychological, sociological, conversational realities in and around us. So yeah, loads to think about, loads to talk about. Please do comment below, and hopefully we can continue, because I I'm just going to keep on thinking about this anyway. So I'd love to have some input from you guys. Please do comment below. As ever, guys, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.
Works it out. We've got ours here. There was a sacrifice to the god. When did he die? He died